All right, folks, let's finish off this day, shall we? Very good. Just a little bit over an hour to go, but we'll make it together. We'll make it together. Anybody come up with any questions during the break you want to ask me about anything? Nope. Yeah. I heard about that. I was going to mention that. I totally forgot it. That's so ridiculous. So absurd. That kidnapping that supposedly happened a few weeks ago, it turns out did not happen. Yeah, the police investigated and they found out that the girl made it up or something. I don't know if it's grounds for arresting, but it might be grounds for some punitive something, like fine her or something, or because like I remember that day when I left here, like at night, there was like ABC News was like on the corner over here. It was like ridiculous, like all based on one person's story. I mean, of course we have to react to that though. Like we can't just, we have to take it seriously. If there's someone kidnapping people out there, like we gotta take it seriously. But fortunately, CSUN is a safer campus than we all thought it was. Well, that was based on her description. It was false. It didn't happen. The LAPD investigated, and they probably talked to her and tried to follow up leads and whatnot that didn't exist. And they used the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model to figure out, oh wait, no, they didn't do that. But we're going to do that right now to figure out movements of the economy in the short run versus the long run. Thank you very much. I'm well versed in transitioning. All right, so again, we're talking about like the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, how they can explain both short run movements and long run movements in the economy due to forces that are either affecting aggregate demand or aggregate supply. We established why aggregate demand looks the way it does and aggregate supply looks the way it does in the first part of the course, the lecture. We talked about the things that shift these curves. So now let's talk about what it means for the shifts for the overall economy. So from 1929 to 1933, the U.S. economy moved down the short-run aggregate supply curve as the aggregate price level fell, as we saw. In contrast, from 1979 to 1980, the U.S. economy moved up the aggregate demand curve as the aggregate price level rose. So anytime you have a movement along one of these curves, it's usually due to shifts of the other curve. So in each case, the cause of the movement along the curve was a shift of the other curve. To understand the behavior of the economy, we must put the aggregate supply curve and aggregate demand curves together. And that will get us to the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. The aggregate supply curve and the aggregate demand curve are used together to analyze economic fluctuations. All right, let's talk about the short-run macroeconomic equilibrium. So again, you've got a downward sloping aggregate demand curve, and you've got an upward sloping short-run aggregate supply curve. And they intersect at the equilibrium price level for the economy. And it is the short-run macroeconomic equilibrium. And it corresponds to the short-run equilibrium output. So the short-run macroeconomic equilibrium is the level of output when the quantity of aggregate output supplied is equal to the quantity demanded. And again, that corresponds to an equilibrium level of output. The short-run equilibrium aggregate output is the quantity of aggregate output produced in the short-run macroeconomic equilibrium. And that also corresponds to a short-run equilibrium price level. So that is there. So the short-run aggregate price level is the price level in the short-run macroeconomic equilibrium. The logic of the market forces that equilibrate the Chapter 3 competitive market applies here. So if the economy was, let's say, at this point here, and the price level corresponded to this level of aggregate supply and this level of aggregate demand, there would be a lot more being produced in the economy than is being consumed, and therefore suppliers would have to lower their prices, which means that there would be movement along the demand curve as the price level goes down to this point. And if the price level was below the equilibrium, the short-run equilibrium, then you would have excess aggregate demand of what is being supplied in the economy, and therefore the consumers, investors, government purchasers, and of course foreign purchasers as well, would start to bid up the prices of what is available in the economy, which would then drive suppliers to supply more, and therefore get us to that equilibrium from the bottom. So whether the economy is above the macroeconomic short-run equilibrium or below it, the market forces will drive the economy to the short-run equilibrium. So we'll assume that the economy is always in some sort of short-run macroeconomic equilibrium, and that something is knocking them out of that short-run equilibrium. So we'll also assume that a fall in the aggregate price level or aggregate output really means a fall compared to long-run trends. So we know that in reality there is an upward long-term trend for the economy to grow and also for prices to increase. We saw that just today with the price level at 1933 versus 2005. It was 7.3% of what it was in 2005. Prices are always increasing, and of course, we saw in just that last time series where we had the potential output increasing even just over the period from 1990 to 2014, demonstrating that upward trend in overall potential output, the amount the economy could produce, increasing over time. So we know that both of those things are always increasing over time. So we assume that there's some average amount that both of those things are increasing. So if, for example, the aggregate price level normally goes up, let's say 4% per year, and you have a year in which the aggregate price level rises only 3% that year, then that would count as a 1% decline for the purposes of our short-run analysis model here. All right, let's talk about the shifts of aggregate demand and the short-run effects on the short-run short-run macroeconomic equilibrium. Okay, so again, a shift of the demand curve is what's called a demand shock. It's an event that shifts the aggregate demand curve. So these can include a change in expectations of wealth, as we already talked about, the effect of the size of the existing stock of capital, or the use of fiscal or monetary policy. So let's say we have, of course, our aggregate demand curve here. We have our short-run aggregate supply curve there. We are at some macroeconomic short-run equilibrium corresponding to this price level and this level of output. All of a sudden, there is a positive demand shock, meaning that aggregate demand increases. Oh, I'm sorry, this is the negative demand shock. So first, we're considering the negative demand shock. Suppose there's a negative demand shock and aggregate demand decreases. So that is going to shift the aggregate demand curve to the left, which will then get us to the new macroeconomic equilibrium, leading to a lower price level in the overall economy and lower overall output, GDP, in the economy as well. And we can consider the opposite case in which you have a downward sloping aggregate demand and the upward sloping short run aggregate supply curve. And that corresponds again to some equilibrium level of output and some price level for the economy. And let's say there is a positive demand shock. Let's say that the government has started to spend more money on education and healthcare and things of that sort. That would increase aggregate demand, shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. And so that would cause a movement along the short-run aggregate supply curve to this new equilibrium price level, where the price level is higher than it was at the original equilibrium level. And also now the economy is producing a lot more than it was initially, again, due to that positive demand shock. All right, and of course, we can have the opposite case where we have shifts of the short-run aggregate supply curve caused by a supply shock. So an event that shifts the short-run aggregate supply curve is known as a supply shock. These can include changes in commodity prices. Again, these are the very generic sort of goods like steel and oil, things that are used in bulk by the major industries that produce. If the prices of those things go up, that causes a negative demand shock. If the prices of those things go down, that causes a positive demand shock. I'm sorry, supply shock. Nominal wages, again, the prices of the labor that's being used. Again, it has to do with costs of producing. So if the costs go up, firms supply less at any given price level. If the costs go down, firms supply more at any given price level. And of course, productivity. We talked about how productivity will also either increase or decrease costs, which will either decrease aggregate supply, or increase aggregate supply, respectively. So let's say we are at, again, some equilibrium where we've got the intersection of the aggregate demand and the short-run aggregate supply, establishing a short-run macroeconomic equilibrium for the economy with a price level and a level of output. And there is a negative supply shock. Let's say that oil prices have gone up dramatically due to the OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, which is a cartel of Middle Eastern countries that supply oil. They meet up every few months, depending on when they need to, and they decide how much oil they're going to supply to the world. And so if they lower the supply, that raises the price of oil, which means that all firms in the U.S. now have to incur higher costs in producing because oil is a major input into all production. And when that happens, we have a negative supply shock, and aggregate supply shifts to the left. Okay, this is the positive supply. That's where I got mixed up. But anyway, let's say oil prices went down, and that caused a positive supply shock, which caused the short-run aggregate supply curve to shift to the right, which lowers the price level in the economy and increases the amount of output. And we have the opposite case where the price of oil went up, in this case, as I originally stated. So that is a negative supply shock, which lowers the short-run aggregate supply curve, causing a higher level of prices and a lower equilibrium quantity of output. So the distinction between the demand shock and supply shock is really important because depending on which one is happening in the economy, that's going to cause like a different set of conditions that can be very painful or not. Supply shocks generally tend to be pretty painful for the economy overall. So imagine a situation in which our output is going down in the economy. If the output's going down in the economy, that means there's more unemployment in the economy. But at the same time, prices are going up. So people are losing their jobs and prices are going up. That's a really tough situation to be in. We've been in a couple of situations like that. Fortunately, not many, but it's definitely a problematic state for the economy. It's one that we're constantly trying to avoid. So we'll talk in the last section of the chapter about macroeconomic policy and how it deals with either demand shocks or supply shocks. So again, this situation where you have a negative supply shock that leads to that painful state of the economy is known as stagflation. It's the combination of inflation and falling aggregate output. It's called stagflation because we have stagnation, meaning that output is not increasing, it's decreasing. Plus we have inflation. So stagflation is probably the worst thing that can happen in an economy. When an economy experiences stagflation, it's very unpleasant. Falling aggregate output leads to rising unemployment, and people feel that their purchasing power is squeezed by rising prices. The distinctive feature of supply shocks, both negative and positive, is that unlike demand shocks, they cause the aggregate price level and aggregate output to move in opposite directions. So even when we have a positive supply shock, we have prices going down and output going up. And so we are producing more, but prices are going down in the economy. And so you have to imagine the from the perspective of a supplier, that's kind of a strange situation to be in, where they are increasing their supply, but they are not getting more money for what they are supplying, which can then cause the economy to turn around in the opposite direction. So another important contrast between supply shocks and demand shocks is that it's much harder for governments to shift aggregate supply curve. So as we talked about, government policy can shift aggregate demand, but it's not one of the things that can shift aggregate supply, because obviously that's completely made up of the private sector, and you can indirectly try to influence the private sector to change their behavior, but it's difficult. So like during the 2008 crisis, the government tried to maybe influence banks to start lending to firms some more, and when they did that, like the measures that they put into place, the banks simply just kind of like sat on them. Like they didn't necessarily do anything, because the private sector doesn't have to respond to government policies. Like there's nothing that says they have to do anything when the government's trying to make them do something. And so that's sort of one of the downsides of having, the free market economy that we have, because you can wind up in a situation where you might have stagflation, where it is important to try to affect aggregate supply, short-run aggregate supply, and we're sort of neutered in our ability to do so, which can be very painful over the long term if it persists.
The part of the government that handles interest rates, so if they raise interest rates,
well, we'll talk about that in after the second exam. It's not a direct thing where it's like the government sets an interest rate. Like they use markets to do it, and so they can influence those markets, but they can't tell the markets what to do. So it's kind of a tricky process. We'll talk more about that later, though. All right, so just really quick, we can look at some of the fluctuations in the economy just based on what the unemployment rate has been doing. Again, if the unemployment rate is going up, then we're likely experiencing a recession, and if the unemployment rate is going down, we're likely experiencing an expansion. And so here we have a time series for that from 1948 to 2014. Generally, most of the spikes in unemployment were due to demand shocks, but a couple were due to supply shocks. So like the Arab-Israeli War in 1973. So when Israel was established as a state, a lot of Middle Eastern countries attacked them, and there were all sorts of wars in the 70s, which caused all sorts of turbulence in the Middle East, which caused a lot of the supply of the oil to dry up, which caused supply shocks, negative supply shocks, which again caused stagflation, which was very painful. So we had that period, and then the Iranian Revolution in 1979 had a similar effect, when the royal families, the Shah, were overthrown, and more sort of not royal family. I'm not going to go into the description of who did what, but it was a problematic state for the Middle East. Again, the entire Middle East was affected by it, and then that of course affected the supply of oil, which caused another supply shock. And you can see post that period we had huge spikes in unemployment, which again were due to stagflation. So demand shocks are the usual culprit, but negative supply shocks are rare and nasty, as those couple of episodes in the U.S.'s history demonstrate. All right, now let's talk about this long-run macroeconomic equilibrium again, this long-run aggregate supply curve that does represent potential output for the economy, output at a level in which all prices are not sticky, are able to change. So here we assume that enough time has elapsed that the economy is on both its short run and on the long run aggregate supply curve. So you've got your aggregate demand curve, you've got your short run aggregate supply curve. They intersect at the short run macroeconomic equilibrium, and that also happens to be the long run macroeconomic equilibrium. So in the long run, the equilibrium is on the long run aggregate supply curve, which represents the fact that in the long run, output is unaffected by the price level. And it does represent potential output for the economy. So short run equilibrium aggregate output is equal to potential output in that case, which again represents the long run macroeconomic equilibrium when the short run macroeconomic equilibrium is on the long run aggregate supply curve. So to see the significance of long run macroeconomic equilibrium, let's consider what happens if there's a demand shock and that moves the economy away from the long run macroeconomic equilibrium. So let's say there's a demand shock and for whatever reason, again, let's just assume that the government is lowering taxes and everybody is able to purchase more at any given price level, which is a positive demand shock with, oh, actually, okay, we're doing a negative one first. I swear, I think I know what I'm going to do with the slides, and then I realize I don't. But that's why I have them on the slides, and I just like follow what they tell me to do. Anyway, that's why I prepare these things in advance, essentially. Okay, anyway, there's a negative demand shock. Let's say taxes went up, and so disposable income went down. And so at any given price level in the economy, folks are demanding less goods, which shifts our aggregate demand curve to the left. Aggregate demand decreases, which then gets us to this macroeconomic short-run equilibrium. So we were initially at the long-run equilibrium. There was a negative demand shock, and we wound up at this short-run macroeconomic equilibrium in which the price level has now gone down, but also the level of output that we are producing is below potential equilibrium GDP. And therefore, it creates what's called a recessionary gap. So the recessionary gap is the difference between the output that is below potential output and potential output. So Y1 minus Y2 is equal to the recessionary gap. Aggregate output is below potential output when we have a recessionary gap. So in this case, we are producing less than potential. That means that we have high unemployment. People are unemployed. Lots of resources that could be used to produce aren't being used to produce. And prices have gone down, but remember, wages are sticky, and therefore the wages are not going down. And so firms are forced to then just supply less goods as the price goes down. Eventually, though, nominal wages do fall. So once those contracts expire, wages start to fall. So the sticky prices eventually become flexible, and that leads producers to increase their output. So at any given price level now, once those wages become flexible, firms are able to supply more because now they have to pay their workers less. That means the cost of production goes down. That means at this price level they can produce more. So there is going to therefore be a positive supply shock that will eventually get the economy back to the equilibrium macroeconomic, the macroeconomic equilibrium in the long run, the one corresponding to the level of potential output. But it's going to be an equilibrium in which the price level is now even lower than it was initially. So that's what a recessionary gap does. A recessionary gap causes the short-run aggregate supply curve to gradually shift to the right over time, getting us back to that potential output level. The economy is then back in long-run macroeconomic equilibrium, reflecting a long-run fall in the aggregate price level. And so the way we characterize that is that the economy is self-correcting, meaning that over time, even though it might be in a bad state, it will fix itself. Now you might have the opposite case where we are at the macroeconomic long-run equilibrium, and let's say, suppose there's a positive aggregate demand shock. So in this case, taxes maybe have gone down, or government spending has gone up, or people expect the economy to be doing better, so they start spending more at any given price level. For whatever reason, aggregate demand has now shifted to the right, which gets us to this new short-run macroeconomic equilibrium that corresponds to a higher level of prices, but also a higher level of output that is above the potential amount of output for the economy. So in that case, we wind up with what's called an inflationary gap. So aggregate output is above potential output. So the amount of output we're at minus the potential output is equal to the inflationary gap. And again, it represents the fact that we are producing more than the economy is capable of producing. And that is causing prices to go up, as we know. But wages haven't adjusted. So prices are going up in the economy, but wages aren't going up. So people's wages aren't increasing. Eventually, those contracts will expire and sticky wages will no longer be sticky because, again, in the long run, due to a short-run macroeconomic positive demand shock that caused the aggregate demand curve to shift to the right and increase equilibrium output, when you have that much output that is above the potential output, then you're going to have very little unemployment, right? A lot of more firms are going to be producing than they would at potential output. Again, if you go back to like the natural rate of unemployment and sort of those periods where the unemployment rate was actually below the natural rate, that is a cyclical unemployment that is positive in that case. It's like getting us to a level of unemployment that's below the natural rate. Whenever that happens, there aren't going to be many workers in the economy, and that will eventually cause wages to go up, right? Eventually, there's a shortage of workers. Suppliers are willing to pay more for workers. So nominal wages will rise, as will other sticky prices. When the prices then go up, again, you're talking about the price of an input. And so eventually, the cost of producing at any given price level for firms is going to go up. And so there's going to be, therefore, a negative demand shock at that point. There's going to be a leftward shift of the short-run aggregate supply curve that will shift the economy back to the long-run aggregate supply macroeconomic equilibrium at potential output of Y1. But of course, that's going to correspond to a higher level of prices overall in the economy. So again, the economy is going to be self-correcting in the long run. Eventually, the economy, even if there is a positive demand shock, that will eventually, and that gets us to a higher level of short-run macroeconomic equilibrium output. Eventually, that will cause us to get back to the long-run macroeconomic equilibrium at potential output, the potential GDP. So again, you can either have an inflationary gap or a recessionary gap, and it has everything to do with whether the short-run macroeconomic equilibrium is either above or below the long-run macroeconomic equilibrium. So to summarize the analysis of how the economy responds to recessionary and inflationary gaps, we can focus on what's called the output gap. The output gap is the percent difference between actual aggregate output and potential output. So the output gap is equal to aggregate output minus potential output divided by potential output times 100. So the amount, the percentage of output that is the deviation from potential output. Our analysis says that the output gap always tends towards zero. We always sort of tend to go back to that long-run macroeconomic equilibrium due to the self-correcting economy nature of our overall economy, when shocks to aggregate demand affect aggregate output in the short run, but not the long run. All right, now let's talk about actual macroeconomic policy that tries to affect the overall economy with respect to the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model we just developed. So yes, it is true that the economy will self-correct in the long run. But the question is, like, how long is the long run? And how long do we have to wait for things to get better? Like, let's say we are in a recessionary gap. Do we just wait for the economy to self-correct? Do we not do anything about it because we know that eventually it will get back to long-run equilibrium? So when there's a bunch of people that are unemployed and um, and maybe even worse as a result of being at the very bottom of the economic ladder, like, should we just say, oh, well, in the long run, it'll all be better? So most macroeconomists believe, however, the process of self-correction typically takes a decade or more. So the long run can take a very long time. So it's not just like right around the corner. Even though, yes, it's something that can eventually happen, are we willing as a society to just allow that process to run its course? So John Maynard Keynes, the guy that developed macroeconomics, is quoted as saying one of the famous sayings of economics in general, which is, "In the long run, we're all dead." Like, that's sort of like his famous statement, and it's an important one because before John Maynard Keynes came along and established the discipline of macroeconomics, which sort of helped to get us out of the Great Depression and created this whole set of tools that the government now uses to help the economy get back to that long-run macroeconomic equilibrium. Before that, this notion of like a self-correcting economy was like the dominant sort of ideology that drove policy with respect to the economy. And so we weren't actively taking a role, the government wasn't actively taking a role in trying to get the economy back to its long-run macroeconomic equilibrium before that. Fortunately, John Maynard Keynes, who was very clear about the fact that in the long run we're all dead, said, well, we can't wait for this economy to self-correct. We have to take an active role in getting us back on course. So economists usually interpret Keynes as having recommended that governments not wait for the economy to correct itself. Instead, it is argued by many economists, but not all, that the government should use both monetary and fiscal policy to get the economy back to potential output in the aftermath of a shift of the aggregate demand curve. And so we use what's called stabilization policy, the use of government policy to reduce the severity of recessions and to rein in excessively strong expansions. All right, so let's say, again, the economy has a negative demand shock, causing us to wind up in a recessionary gap where actual output is below potential output. If policymakers react quickly to the fall in aggregate demand, they can use either monetary or fiscal policy to shift the aggregate demand curve back to the right. So if they act quickly, that could potentially happen. This policy would be preferable for two reasons. One is that the temporary fall in aggregate output that would happen without policy intervention is a bad thing. This leads to unemployment. People get hurt by unemployment. Recessions are a bad thing. And price stability is generally regarded as a desirable goal. One of the main focuses of the economy, with the government policies with respect to the economy, is to try to maintain a stable level of prices. And so, therefore, it would be a good idea for the economy to the government to quickly jump in and cause a positive demand shock in the face of a negative demand shock that would then shift the demand curve to the right. This, of course, doesn't mean that policymakers should always act to offset decline in aggregate demand. There is a possibility that there can be too much government spending, which might lead to high amounts of inflation. We'll talk about that when we get to the inflation chapter. Some policy measures to increase aggregate demand, especially those that increase budget deficits. Again, when the government spends money and it is beyond the revenue that they're collecting, then they have a budget deficit, and that can be a problem over a long period of time. This may have long-term costs in terms of lower long-run growth, and that's going to be discussed in later chapters. They talked about the deficit in part in the last debate. If you guys watched the last debate, did you watch the last debate? Raise your hand if you watched the last debate. Okay, good. You should be watching these debates. Watch them on YouTube. They're still on there. They're really interesting. Just just to see people acting crazy that are like super important, that are going to have really a lot of responsibility, a lot of impact in our lives. It's just funny to see them act like children. But they do bring up a lot of important topics, and the deficit was brought up, but it was brought up by the moderator, and they quickly kind of like didn't really talk about it. But nonetheless, like it is definitely something that we need to deal with, but we also do need to constantly be monitoring the economy and making sure that we don't wind up in expanded periods of recession, because that can be very painful and hard for everyone, especially people at the very bottom, but really the entire world economy is affected by anything that happens in the US. And so we need to be careful for several reasons. But again, like using too much spending by the government that can create too many deficits and increase prices too much is potentially a problem. This creates the danger that attempts to stabilize the economy may end up creating more instability. Despite these qualifications, most economists do believe that a good case can be made for using macroeconomic policy to offset major negative shocks to the aggregate demand curve. Now the question is, should the government intervene with a positive demand shock? So again, you might have a positive demand shock where the price level then increases and the amount of aggregate output is above the potential, which means we have an inflationary gap in that case. So the concern is that any short-run gains from an inflationary gap must be paid back later. So policymakers today usually try to offset positive as well as negative demand shocks. So it can be problematic when the economy is heating up and working above potential output, because eventually that has to change. We have to go back to potential output, and so that means that eventually prices will either decrease or increase quite a bit, and that there will be unemployment in that process of getting back to potential output. So for reasons we'll explain in chapter 15, attempts to eliminate recessionary gaps and inflationary gaps usually rely on monetary policy rather than fiscal policy. So monetary policy is the main policy tool that sort of helps the government to be able to sort of control these shifts of aggregate demand, which can cause huge impacts in every level of the economy. Now, supply shocks are different. Again, supply shocks are the kind of shocks that can lead to stagflation, which is the most painful state that the economy can wind up in. The effects of a negative supply shock is that in the short run there is lower aggregate output but a higher aggregate price level. So we have that stagflation. In contrast to the aggregate demand curve, there's no easy policies that shift the short run aggregate supply curve. Thus, the policy response to a negative supply shock cannot aim to simply push the curve that shifted back to its original position, because again, government policies cannot shift the aggregate supply curve. So any policy that shifts the aggregate demand curve helps one problem only by making the other worse. So it might help with prices, but it might hurt with employment and vice versa. So in the stagflation of the 1970s, the United States and other economically advanced nations suffering from the supply shocks eventually chose to stabilize prices, even at the cost of higher unemployment. So they did choose to influence demand, aggregate demand in those cases, but even though in that case the prices were stable, unemployment persisted for an extended period of time, which can be very painful for the entire economy. So that's the end of the chapter stuff. We'll go on to some practice problems right now. But ideally, you can see how like powerful this model is. It's a very simple model, but if you understand everything that I covered today as far as like the things that shift the curves, the meaning of the equilibrium, what the long run equilibrium versus the short run equilibrium is, and like the things that maybe the government can do to affect those things, and then you understand how powerful this model is, and how important it is, but also like the intuition that you can gain about how the overall economy is functioning by just thinking about it when you hear like a news story about things that are happening. Like you can just think, okay, well, as far as like the aggregate demand, aggregate supply curve and the equilibrium, like how is this affecting that? What's going to happen in the economy? Is this a demand shock? Is this a supply shock? If it's a demand shock, does the government jump in and do something? I have an opinion about that now, given what I know about this model. So it's a powerful model. It is useful to understand as just a general tool of being like a responsible, well-rounded citizen. And so it is worth your time to actually know it and put it in your utility belt for life. All right, let's do a couple of practice problems and then we will call it a day. So practice short answer, aggregate demand effects. Determine the effect on aggregate demand of each of the following events. Explain whether it represents a movement along the aggregate demand curve, either up or down, or a shift of the demand curve, leftward or rightward. So again, we've got our aggregate demand, aggregate supply. We got the aggregate price level on the y-axis and real GDP on the x-axis. Got that downward sloping aggregate demand curve, upward sloping short-run aggregate supply curve, and of course an equilibrium level of prices and output for the economy. So that's what we're assuming we are at some short-run macroeconomic equilibrium. And remember, there are factors that shift aggregate demand, changes in expectations, changes in wealth, size of the existing stock of physical capital, fiscal policy, and monetary policy. Factors that shift aggregate supply include changes in commodity prices, changes in nominal wages, and changes in productivity. All right, so the first one is a rise in the interest rate caused by a change in monetary policy. So monetary policy has caused a change in the interest rate. So remember we talked about how the government might expand the money supply. So if the government expands the money supply, that increases the amount of loanable funds in the loanable funds market, which causes a rightward shift of the supply of funds, which causes what to happen to the interest rate? The equilibrium interest rate. What's that? So supply, this is demand, sorry. Supply shifts to the right, right? Because now there's more money in the economy. The government has increased the money supply. So the supply has shifted to the right. So what's happened to equilibrium price, the interest rate? It's decreased, right? Yeah. So the interest rate has gone down. So that means the opportunity cost of spending has decreased. That means people are going to spend more, right? So this is a shift of the aggregate demand curve. So at any given price level, folks are going to demand more due to the fact that now there's more money in the economy, more money to be lent out, lowering the interest rate, increasing the propensity to consume by people. So is this what direction is this a shift of the aggregate demand curve? To the left or to the right? To the right, right? Exactly. So a decrease in the quantity of money raises the interest rate. A higher interest rate reduces investment and consumer spending. Cause a change in monetary policy. A rise in the interest rate caused by a change in monetary policy. Oh, okay, so that was a rise in the interest rate. I'm sorry, I got it totally mixed up. I went the wrong direction. So change in monetary policy that caused a rise in the interest rate meant that the supply curve shifted to the left. You were right. Right, exactly. So that means that there was less money in the economy. The supply curve shifted to the left, and the interest rate went up, which means that the opportunity cost of consuming has now gone up. That means people are going to consume less, and therefore the aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the left, not the right. Sorry about that. So yes, so the aggregate demand curve will shift to the left. So it's good. It's a good idea maybe to draw these things for yourself. Like if you're given something like this, kind of draw the markets and figure out what direction things are moving in. Because you might be tired, like I am right now, and just not be thinking clearly, like I wasn't. Anyway, so in this case, the aggregate demand curve shifts to the left as a result of a rise in the interest rate. All right, so B, a fall in the real value of money in the economy due to a higher aggregate price level. Is that going to cause a movement along the aggregate demand curve or a shift of the aggregate demand curve? Just a movement, right? Exactly. So this is the interest rate effect of the interest rate effect. One of the two effects that explains the downward slope of the aggregate demand curve. So when the so the real value of money, if the price level goes up, then the real value of money goes down, and therefore firms and households will demand more, will borrow more money, which will increase the demand for loanable funds, right? So here's the demand for loanable funds. It'll increase it. That means that the interest rate will go up, which means the opportunity cost of spending goes up. That means people spend less. So a fall in the real value of money in the economy due to a higher aggregate price level means a movement along the aggregate demand curve. As the aggregate price level rises, the real value of money holdings falls. This is the interest rate effect of a change in the aggregate price level. As the value of money falls, people want to hold more money. They do so by borrowing more and lending less. This leads to a rise in the interest rate and a reduction in consumer and investment spending. So again, that is a movement up the aggregate demand curve or a movement along to the left. All right, part C, news of a worse than expected job market next year. Expectations, very good. So this is expectation. So is this going to cause a movement along or a shift of the aggregate demand curve? Shift, right? So worse than expected. So which direction? Exactly. It's going to be a decrease in aggregate demand, a negative demand shock. So there's a shift of the aggregate demand curve, expectations of a poor job market, and so lower average disposable incomes will reduce people's consumer spending today at any given aggregate price level. So the aggregate demand curve shifts to the left. Again, this is expectations. A fall in tax rates. Movement along or shift? Shift, right? Exactly. It's a shift. It's fiscal policy, taxing and spending. If taxes go down, disposable income goes up. So at any given price level, people are willing to buy more. And so therefore you have a what? A rightward or a leftward shift in the aggregate demand curve? Rightward, right? An increase in aggregate demand. A fall in the tax rate raises people's disposable income, as I said, any given price. Aggregate price level, consumer spending is now higher, so the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right. E, a rise in the real value of assets in the economy due to a lower aggregate price level. Shift or movement? Movement, right? The cause here is a change in the price level. So when there's a change in the price level, that's a movement because the aggregate demand curve is a relationship between the output, the aggregate demand in the economy, and the price level. So if the price level is affecting the wealth, then you're just going to move along the demand curve. It is, again, one of the reasons why you have a downward sloping aggregate demand curve. One is the wealth effect and the other one is the interest rate effect. This is the wealth effect. So this is a movement down along the aggregate demand curve. As the aggregate price level falls, the real value of assets rise. This is the wealth effect of a change in the aggregate price level. As the real value of assets rise, people will increase their consumption plans. This leads to higher consumer spending. So this is in contrast to anything else that might be affecting the value of wealth. So if it's the price level that's affecting the value of your wealth, your savings, then that's going to cause a movement along. But if it's anything else affecting the wealth of your asset, the real value of that wealth, then that will cause a shift of the aggregate demand curve. So that will be the next one here. So you have a rise in the real value of assets in the economy due to a surge in real estate values. So in this case, real estate values have gone up. Probably in housing markets, there's been a huge increase in demand in housing markets, which has caused like property values to skyrocket across the economy. Properties are part of people's wealth. They are people's assets. So all of a sudden, their wealth goes up in the economy. The wealth is not going up because the price level is going down. It's going up because of some other force, in this case, movements in the real estate markets. So is that going to cause a movement along the aggregate demand curve or a shift of the aggregate demand curve? A shift, right? Exactly. So you have to understand the distinction between those two effects on wealth in order to understand whether you have a movement along the aggregate demand curve or a shift of the aggregate demand curve. Yeah.
What about the sentiment of people
Right. Surge in real estate values, not the price level. If it's saying the price level, if the value of your wealth, which is made up of your assets, your savings, in whatever form they take, is being affected by the price level, then that will be a movement along the aggregate demand curve. If your wealth is being affected by anything else besides the price level, a shift. Well, unemployment is not going to affect your wealth, but unemployment is a result of shifts in the demand. Yeah, but that will affect incomes in the economy. Yeah. So this is a shift of the aggregate demand curve, a rise in the real value of assets in the economy due to a surge in real estate values, raises consumer spending at any given aggregate price level. When the equity in homes go up, people usually take out home equity loans. They take that money out and they start spending like crazy. That's what happened in the 2000s before the crash. So the aggregate demand curve does shift to the right under those circumstances. All right, let's turn to short-run aggregate supply effects. So determine the effect on short-run aggregate supply of the following events. Explain whether it represents a movement along the short-run aggregate supply curve or a shift of the short-run aggregate supply curve. A rise in the consumer price index leads producers to increase output. All right, what is the consumer price index? Thank you for your honesty. Remember, the consumer price index is how we measure the price level in the economy, right? It's like we take a basket of goods and we figure out how are the prices of all these things changing over time, which then gives us a price index, which then allows us to track the price level of the economy. So a rise in the price index means what? A rise in the what? In the price level. Remember, the short-run aggregate supply curve is a relationship between the price level and aggregate supply, right? And so if there's a rise in the consumer price index, that leads producers to increase output, meaning we just have a movement along the aggregate supply curve. In what direction? Up, yeah, exactly, to the right. So this represents a movement along the short-run aggregate supply curve because the CPI, like the GDP deflator, is a measure of the aggregate price level, the overall price level of final goods and services in the economy. A fall in the price of oil leads producers to increase output. To shift, right? Exactly. This is a commodity price, right? Oil is a main input into all production processes in the United States and in most developed countries. So this represents a shift of the short-run aggregate supply curve because oil is a commodity. What direction is it shifting in? To the right, right? Because now production is cheaper at any given price level and they produce more, therefore. The short-run aggregate supply curve will shift to the right because production costs are now lower, leading to a higher quantity of aggregate output supplied at any given aggregate price level. A rise in legally mandated retirement benefits paid to workers leads producers to reduce output. It's not one, it's the other, right? So yeah, like remember, like retirement benefits are wages as well. Like anything that you get from your employer, that's some sort of benefit, is considered like part of your wages. And so in this case, the wages are going up because they've been legally mandated to increase the benefits to the workers, and therefore at any given price level, it costs producers more to produce because their costs have gone up. Now they have to pay their workers a little bit more, and so That will shift the aggregate supply curve to what direction? The left, right? So this represents a shift of the short-run aggregate supply curve because it involves a change in nominal wages. An increase in legally mandated benefits to workers is equivalent to an increase in nominal wages. As a result, the short-run aggregate supply curve will shift leftward because production costs are now higher, leading to a lower quantity of aggregate output supplied at any given aggregate price level. All right, and then we'll do one last one, and we will call it a day. All right, aggregate demand and supply adjustments. So using aggregate demand, short-run aggregate supply, and long-run aggregate supply curves, explain the process by which each of the following economic events will move the economy from one long-run macroeconomic equilibrium to another. Illustrate with diagrams. In each case, what are the short-run and long-run effects on the aggregate price level and the aggregate output? So you might be expected to draw some of this stuff and demonstrate to me what's happening on these curves. So in this case, there's a decrease in households' wealth due to a decline in the stock market. So what is that going to affect? Aggregate demand, right? And what's it going to do to it? Right, it's going to shift it to the left, right? So what's that going to do to the price level? Did you say decrease? You were correct. So imagine that we are initially at the long run macroeconomic equilibrium. So is that going to cause an inflationary gap or a recessionary gap? A recessionary gap, right? If aggregate demand shifts to the left, then that will cause us to get to a lower level of output below potential, and therefore we're going to have a recessionary gap. So here's our long run aggregate supply curve representing potential output. Here's aggregate demand 1, and here's short run aggregate supply 1. There's that initial equilibrium. There's that initial price level corresponding to that equilibrium. There's the initial output level corresponding to that equilibrium. Of course, aggregate demand, a decrease in households' wealth will reduce consumer spending, which means that aggregate demand will shift to the left, getting us to that short-run equilibrium now, right? That's corresponding to a lower price level and a lower level of output, leading to a recessionary gap, which is identified here and should be identified. In the short run, nominal wages are sticky and the economy will be in short run macroeconomic equilibrium at E2. What is going to cause us to get back to long run macroeconomic equilibrium? What's that? Wait 10 years and it'll fix itself, right? But how does it fix itself? Remember, what happens that allows us to then get back to that long run macroeconomic equilibrium? You know, that's if we want to try to avoid it self-correcting on its own over 10 years. But what if we allow it to happen on its own? What will eventually cause us to get back to long run? So wages will no longer be sticky, right? So it's not that the wages will increase. Prices have gone down, so therefore producers are waiting for wages to be able to go down too, because they can't do it initially because they're locked into wages by contracts. Eventually, those wages will eventually go down. So when wages go down, who does that affect? Like, well, what side of the market will that affect now? The supply, right? The short run aggregate supply. Is that going to shift it to the left or to the right? To the right, because now their costs have gone down. So at any given price, they can supply more. So, so therefore, the aggregate supply curve, the short run aggregate supply curve, we're initially at this equilibrium, will shift to the right to short run aggregate supply 2, getting us to this new long run equilibrium at E3, corresponding to a much lower price level than we were at initially, but of course also corresponding to potential output, us back at the level of potential output for the economy. So at E3, the economy is back at its potential output, but at a much lower aggregate price level. B, the government lowers taxes, leaving households with more disposable income with no corresponding reduction in government purchases. So what's going to happen to the market that is initially at long-run equilibrium? So aggregate demand will increase, right? It will shift to the right. So initially we are at, let's say, this equilibrium here, E1. Aggregate demand will shift to the right, which will get us to this short-run economic equilibrium, corresponding to a higher price level and a level of output that is higher than at potential. So therefore we have a, what kind of gap? Inflationary gap, which is identified there and should be identified. Prices are going up, but what prices are not going up initially? Prices are now going up because aggregate demand shifted to the right, right? What prices aren't going up though? What prices aren't going up? Wages. Wages are sticky, right? Wages are sticky in the short run. But eventually, wages aren't sticky, which is what gets us back to that long-run equilibrium, right? So prices are going up, but wages aren't going up. Contracts eventually expire. Those prices eventually will start to go up as well. As wages start to go up, the costs of suppliers start to go up. So what's going to happen then? Of what? The short-run aggregate supply curve to the left, right? Exactly. To the point where it'll get us back to that long-run macroeconomic equilibrium at potential output, closing the inflationary gap, but leaving us at a state where the price level is much higher than it was originally. Any questions on this whole process, this model, how it works, the effects? All right. I think we've been very clear with each other about how this works and what could happen and how that could affect the model. Just like we did last week with the income expenditure model. These things are recorded for you. You have them as a reference. You can always go back to them. Exam in 2 weeks. Have a good Halloween. Yeah, have a good Halloween, right? Because we won't see each other until after Halloween. So have a good, safe Halloween. I'll see you next week.